offerings for workshops the rest of the semester. We're going to get started soon on programming for the spring. So if you have suggestions of things that you'd like to see, there's a contact information on that website where you can reach out and let us know what type of workshops you would be interested in. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Jordan.
Hey, hello. Thank you, Lindsay. So I'm going to go ahead and share here. Okay. I don't see anybody's video anymore, so if you could just give me a quick audible confirmation that you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as Lindsay said, my name is Jordan Sly. I'm going to do sort of the first part here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some background on DH and digital humanities, give a little bit of a primer on that, and do a quick tour of some projects to kind of help give a little bit of inspiration, hopefully, for some directions in digital humanities. And then Raf is going to go through the difficult technical part. He's going to show a lot more of the nuts and bolts of how these projects come together, what it looks like to use data in the humanities, and to kind of go through how they did that for some of these projects, especially the ones that he's worked on as well. So he'll be able to explain those in more detail. So that's our basic outline here, and we'll go from there. So as I said, this is a very quick overview of the digital humanities, and it's difficult because digital humanities doesn't have just one solid definition. Looking at this Twitter account, for example, the digital humanities or defining DH, we can see this quite plainly. This account tweets quotes from DH literature where the authors define their definition of DH. As you can imagine, they have a lot of tweets, and the page is mostly defunct now, but the point is that many of the definitions, there are as many definitions of DH as there are practitioners. As a methodology, however, looking at DH as a confluence of traditional humanities methods, combining them with computational technology, and understanding and explicating the value added by this approach is a serviceable working conception. The aim with DH is to enhance a project through the use of digital tools in a way that can't be done with traditional methods. It's important to note that there are many hundreds, if not more, DH projects being currently worked on, so defining a specific notion is really next to impossible given the varied ways that projects have expanded and iterated on these definitions. Many projects fall within a classical conception of the humanities and focus on textual analysis or historical analysis in multiple formats, through geographical data, historical data, such as inventories or other snapshots of the past, musical information, video, sound, etc. The list goes on. DH allows humanists to use the expanded sense of text, documentation, and evidence to put into a new context all of these components for better, deeper analysis and, more importantly, discovery. All of this is to say, we'll be giving some examples to show that there is no real one universal digital humanities. And each version of it really kind of is based on the core discipline that the scholar is working from. And then also the level of technology that they need in order to best sort of exemplify this. So for example, digital history will, despite the use of its of sort of digital technologies, will still be focused on explaining facets of history in ways similar to traditional methods, often, though, only at a sort of grander scale. With the inclusion of higher order, and at a grander scale with the inclusion of higher order analysis and visualization, the important shift here becomes the method of presentation. As I'll show with Ruth and Sebastian Annert's Marian Letters project and the 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon project, often DH gives visibility to data that might otherwise be hidden. I found this in my own project on the Recusant print network. My aim was to make immediate data that can otherwise be obscured through its normal format. The remediation is typically the point of digital humanities, to remove barriers of traditional scholarship and to allow greater visibility. And the collocation of data and the better ability to demonstrate change over time in a compelling way, or to allow further and deeper interaction with material in a way not possible with traditional scholarship. An example of this is found in the early modern soundscapes project that we're going to be looking at shortly, where sound, manuscripts, and modern transcription bring music from this period to life in ways that a traditional monograph, for example, cannot. This is also where experiments with augmented reality can add excitement, especially for students, as they can see a world past the world of the past forming around them in their current space with a sort of ghostly spatial overlap. These projects use traditional methods and the varied data available to them, such as handwritten music scores, geographic data, letters, newspapers, and more, and remix it into a new and more engaging format, showing as opposed to telling in most ways. Other digital humanists, however, for other digital humanists, however, the digital is the main focus in a nearly mirrored way. So researchers like Matthew Kirschenbaum and his students here at UMD focus on born digital technologies and the creation of digital media and digital media archaeology. For them, the idea is to look with a humanist lens towards the developed technologies and work to understand the societal factors of its creation and the epistemological framework for its existence, success, or failure, among other things, of course. Digital humanities has been called the, quote, next big thing for a very long time. That particular quote comes from the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2009, but it's a thing that's often also quite misunderstood by traditional scholars who either look at DH as frivolous or unserious or unnecessary, or conversely, as the savior of the humanities and the way forward towards, as is usually the problem, funding. Matthew Gold, for example, who has been a leading voice in DH of a certain generation, has been editing and contributing to an ongoing series of essays and project descriptions called The Debates in the Digital Humanities since about 2012. Beginning with his foundational essay, which was originally published in 2010, and until the most recent edition, which is 2019, I think, matters of definition and purpose have been consistently present in this series. So they've been working out these issues of what is the digital humanities this whole time. At the heart of much of this debate is the notion of at what point is new media part of the humanities? In other words, to traditional humanities departments, how recent is too recent and how digital is too digital to matter. Additionally, as most DH projects require a hefty order of coding skills and often a team of DH tech experts, at what point does DH lose its footing in the scholarly mission of traditional humanities departments and become little more than a tech venture? It's also worth mentioning that DH is not simply a product of the 2000s. The Association for Computers in the Humanities was founded back in 1978, and even some of the current projects that are currently talked about and ongoing have their conception back in the 90s. So this is not a hot new trend, but an evolving area of humanistic practice with a vast body of research behind it. A founding voice in digital humanities scholarship is Franco Moretti, whose papers analyzing large text data sets of text culled and curated from digitized 19th century material give us the notion of distance reading, for example. Distance reading is essentially the ability to see phrases, words, and constructions across an author's text in corporea. In other words, to zoom out from the individual word, the individual page, the individual book, the individual author, and so on, and to see how individual words pair with others across a spectrum. With this ability to zoom out, we can see sentiment and other themes in a larger way than is possible by an individual scholar. As Joanna Drucker points out in her essay, Humanistic Theory and Digital Scholarship, it is still an ongoing question as to whether digital humanities are doing anything particularly new or simply rephrasing existing scholarship with newer language. But the new language is important, and it's an important evolution in the new scholarship. In other words, the novelty comes from the advances that are represented by this new language. Of additional importance, many of the terms and techniques come from the world of big data, and therefore reflect a new scope and a scale for humanistic practice. A major early tool, and one with a very low barrier to entry, is the Google Books Ngram Viewer. This tool allows some very basic but insightful text analysis, and has been the inspiration for many digital humanities projects in their early forms. Google Books Ngram allows users to formulate a search within Google Books, which is a huge data set, not fully comprehensive, but a very interesting body of literature, and view the recurrence of a phrase over time. In this very basic example, we can see the printed instances. Again, it's a digitized corpus of things that are usually printed. We can see the term utopia and where it has peaks and valleys from its first uses to more modern uses. Again, first uses is in quotes there. Additionally, if we could do a search for Jane Austen, we can see sort of some interesting things that kind of correlate with our knowledge of Jane Austen. So to see here, we can see her relative references across her printed literature to give some basic insights. These are the basic sort of starting points that can enhance traditional scholarship, and as I mentioned, are often the beginning stages of more developed and interesting projects. So this just gives a kind of visualization for a term paper or something. I mean, it's not terribly exciting, but it does give a sort of starting point into digital humanities. Another source of nearly limitless data that is, with some effort, mineable without a team of dedicated DHers is Twitter. Many projects looking at general sentiment analysis, linguistic analysis, topic coverage, and more have focused on Twitter as a stand-in for other textual sources. This data can give researchers an immediate view of an event, such as the Black Lives Matter marches and movements, political events around the world, or understand online communities. This data is often paired with other available data, such as mapping data and GIS. So many available DH package programs can read latitude and longitude data, for example. And using the Google Maps API is actually quite easy. So like with the Ngram viewer, the ease of entry allows some creativity and the basic development of projects. My own interest in digital humanities stemmed from a conference on bibliometrics, of all things. Bibliometrics is essentially the citation analysis and research data mining within the world of journal impact factors, tenure competition, and research impact analysis. It's a bit dry. And in this conference, I was more or less introduced to the notions of network analysis, another popular format for digital humanities. At a very basic level, network analysis weighs the connective fibers between indicated elements and allows the researcher to understand the importance of individual nodes in relationship to others based on the weight of their edges. So in most constructions of this, nodes are represented as circles and edges as lines, and the weight of the connection is then usually represented by the size of the nodes and the lines based on the frequency of the sort of collocation in the data. Simple analysis and visualization software such as Gephi and Tableau can be used to create basic visualizations like these. And these are sort of basic network analysis tools. Importantly, however, like with the Google tools, this is an entry point and not typically the end goal of a project. Bigger projects, usually funded, have far more advanced tools which allow for predictive modeling and dynamic visualization, accounting for new data, such as tweets, or new formulations of existing data, such as the 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon project, which I'll show here in a second. Ultimately, the success of a project rests on both its theoretical framework, the use of digital tools as an integral part of the conceptual process, and the ability to iterate and adapt to more data and dimensions as applicable. Most projects, or many projects, stall out, as with my own, frankly, when the limitations outweigh the possibilities. Many of my colleagues have found similar problems as they reach a point where they're no longer able to handle the level of work on their own, the volume and the technical capabilities, et cetera. For very few digital humanists, a project, a singular project is their only job. Therefore, upkeep and progress is often very difficult. Many projects end up relying on crowdsourcing for translations, amongst other things. And this can be time consuming in its own right and can have mixed results, as you can imagine. So Ralph will give a lot more detail about the nature of data in the humanities and the practical applications needed to actually do DH. And I've tried to give something of a primer on the topic, but there isn't a way to do justice on the vast variety of projects in the DH field. My bias, as clear through this, is towards history and literature projects because I'm a historian, but there are projects to explore in nearly every humanities field. So what I want to do next with that is to show some of these projects, a little snapshot of some projects that are utilizing some of the tools that we've been discussing, just kind of show off what they are and work through them a little bit. But with a lot of these, you can't do a whole lot of work. I just kind of want to show you some things to look at. Here's a quick snapshot of some literature to get started in DH if you're interested, and I can share this I'll share all the slides when this is over, but that's where you can find some of that. So here's a small smattering of some of the types of some of the projects. These are some big projects. A couple of them are associated with UMD. So I wanted to pull those out specifically, but I mentioned 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon a couple of times. So I'm going to click on that. And since I've left Google Slides, are people seeing the presentation showing up, or the project showing up?
Yes.
Here? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon project. This is, it's not the first digital humanities project or anything like this, but it's one of the first to get a lot of notoriety within the history field, at least within the field that I'm most familiar with in early modern history. There have been others, of course, but this is one of the early projects that got some traction. What it does is it's a network analysis project, and it shows the connections between various people to our boy Francis Bacon. And this is an interesting project as it smatters out through literature networks, both formal and informal. So it's sort of letters and mentions in actually quite a social media way. So if Thomas Hobbes mentions Francis Bacon in a letter, for example, then that's a connection. But if he mentions it to someone else, one of these other nodes along the way, then it's a sort of a looser connection, and so on and so forth. So you can see all of the strength of some of these edges being darker colors and some lighter, and then the real hubs here. So and these are the really important people by and large. But what you can do is if we can add a person. So I'm going to add someone that I work with, a figure that I work with. I don't know him personally because he's been dead for a while. But I'll add in my friend Samuel Moreland, for example. And what you can do here is if we dive into an example, now we see the connective tissue between just these two people, and we can start to kind of work through how they know each other. So for Samuel Moreland, for example, did not know Sir Walter Raleigh or Queen Elizabeth or Robert Cecil, but he did, he was knighted by King Charles. He likely knew Samuel Pepys, definitely knew John Thurlow, and I'm not sure if he knew Thomas Hobbes, but he definitely knew John Milton, for example, who's another one of these nodes most surely. So what that does is, as a researcher, that allows us to go in to a particular person and work through their connections. And if I go to Samuel Moreland's node, it'll also give me more information about his network more broadly, and so on and so forth. You can also take this out of this network and link out to their biographical information through the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, for example. And it's a good way to build a project if you're sort of stuck. So it's an interesting conceptual project. And I mentioned what makes one of the elements of this sort of interesting at a DH level, or sort of at a programmatic level, is the fact that it's dynamic. So there is a data set in here, but it is ever changing as new networks are added, new connections and things are added in. That predictive element, the thing that allows me to make the two connections between different people, that predictive element is one of the real challenges there of connecting up a vast variety of data. If we go, well, sort of stalled out a little bit here. My computer is whirling. You can look at a lot of the, the team behind it, but I think one of the most important things to note is how many people, how many different groups are involved in this project, at varying levels, but there are funding agencies and sponsorships and things making the programming side. You can see if you go through their list here, I mean, they have dedicated programmers and so on and so forth. And they've gotten, a lot of news and everything here. That's a little bit different than some other projects where there's maybe one or two people associated. Another example is something like, this is a simpler example, but here's the spread of slavery in the US here from 1790 to 1860. And what you have here is, a pretty basic breakdown of census data. And what this allows you to do is, as you pull the slider here, it changes the nature of what the country looks like and the rates of slavery and so on and so forth. So you can see just in a short amount of time, how things change in that period of time, both in the conception of the states and then as it moves forward. So you know, you can adjust a lot of these here too. So we can say, we can adjust a lot of these different factors. And again, this is just census information data, you know, remixed in a different way that allows it to kind of visualize and make more interesting what everybody's looking at when they're looking at your paper and your data. Women Writers Project, I have to just kind of skip through a bit briefly because it's a subscription-based project, but it does have interesting elements here, and it is worth kind of poking around in their publications and things. Most of these projects will have publications associated with them, so it is worth, you know, taking a look through their publications to see what they're writing about for their projects. If we go to the Shelley Godwin Archive, this is a UMD affiliated project and one that Raf is a part of as well, so he can, there he is, talk in more detail about all of this, of course. But you know, that you have one of the main uses for historical, you know, digital history and digital literature studies and digital humanities is essentially digitizing things that are difficult to view otherwise. And so, you know, you have even just in the basic presentation of primary sources of, you know, sort of facsimile versions of this. This is very valuable just in and of itself for historians, especially at times like this where we can't travel. So being able to actually see things that we can't see is important, and the sort of transcription element of this too. You can see here, being a little bit slow, so I'm worried it's going to stall out. I had a catastrophic crash yesterday, so there we go. And the transcription part being, of course, the most important here, right? So it makes readable this, which is challenging to say the least, to read. So the sort of visualizing the primary sources and things is a very interesting part of all of this. And I mentioned the Protestant Letter Network here too. This is just a simple, I wanted to kind of show a drier example in the scholarship, but this is a very important paper in digital humanities. And you can see it looks very similar to the Francis Bacon project, but it's static. And my own project is static like this as well. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of some of these things and some of the difficulties that a lot of us have, where we kind of reach a stalling point where we can present the data, but making the sort of hard coding behind it is a lot more difficult. I'm going to just briefly go into this, but actually Raf will go into more detail about this, and it's probably better for him to talk about it anyway. In fact, the link that I put here is the wrong one, so we'll probably just have Raf talk about it, if that's okay, Raf. But I mentioned during the other part of the talk, the idea of kind of combining primary sources and then remediating them and making them available in a different way. This is a good example of that project, where now taking extant sources and kind of pushing them into a way where they're more interactive and more interesting in a different way, create something that you cannot do in a traditional format. So in all of these projects, what you have is something that is not impossible to represent in traditional humanities, but difficult. And there are good examples here of the benefits of DH in a non-superfluous way, right? There are things here, again, that you cannot do otherwise. So this allows you to, these formats allow you to do something that you couldn't do otherwise, or would have to do over, an entire career, showing each breakdown of this census data, for example. If you were to just write about every part of this, you would have to do it in smaller increments, and the changes would have to be, discussed as opposed to shown. And so it kind of moves you past some elements of scholarship and allows you to kind of dig into other aspects that may be more interesting. Again, this is something that I found in my own research, was that, once I kind of put everything out on the table, I mean, it was sort of akin to spreading a bunch of cards out on the table. I could see themes and networks that can't be seen as easily through the traditional presentation of the data, which is in archival folders, right? So in those things, in those archival folders, it's hidden, stored away, and by sort of making them visible in a more orientable fashion, I was able to kind of see new connections that weren't talked about before. So those are some of the benefits and some of the general methods of digital humanities. I'm going to stop sharing now. And it's also, let's see, how do I, it's also unnerving to talk to nobody. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to hand it over to Raf to go on to the next section.
Thank you, Jordan. Okay. I'm going to sort of continue Jordan's overview of digital humanities work and focus a little bit more on methodologies rather than projects, and branch out to specific projects and tools and that are associated with certain methodologies. Digital humanities, as Jordan explained, is complicated. So even though I had a chance to participate in a number of different types of digital humanities, I certainly have a bias when it comes to like the things that I know more or less, or the kind of research that I tend to do. So I'll do my best to give sort of an overview of some methodologies that I think are important and relevant in the field. I want to start from talking about what is data in the humanities, because essentially before we are able to do any kind of operations with computers on the subject of study of the humanities, we need to make sure that computers can actually operate with them. And there is a fair bit of literature that discusses this. I think a lot of the output about this topic, what is data in the humanities, was probably discussed between 10, 15 years ago. But it has also, a long history anyway. I'm just talking about sort of volume here, and it continues as, our use of computers and shape of data changes and goes forward. But I certainly like to look back at this paper by Julia Flanders, who's a research professor at Northeastern University, who sort of defines data as a state in which information is subjected to the strict codification of the measurable. Essentially, what she's suggesting here is that as soon as we start working with a cultural object, that is our object of investigation as humanists, if we want to make it into data, so that computers can use it, it has to be codified in a way that makes it measurable. And going through this operation, we leave our mark in a way and on the cultural object that we're trying to model. And that's an important fact that I'll return to in a minute. And once you have your objects in a shape that can be measured, then you can do something with it. So her quote continues. I'm actually going to read it from the beginning. Data is a state in which information is subjected to the strict codification of the measurable, and in which a further numerical, statistical, quantificatory activity upon the information is thereby made possible. So essentially, once you can measure it, you can count it, you can quantify it, you can transform it, you can start doing operations with it. And that's what allows you to run computational analyses on data, on humanities data. You can build archives, you can build sort of dynamic online resources, or you can derive more sort of static results that you can present in multiple ways. But before you achieve those, you need to have the cultural object rendered as data. And in order to do that, as I mentioned earlier, you end up taking important decisions about how you're going to represent something. And that act itself has been an object of study. And William McCarthy wrote an entire book about this idea, in particular the concept of modeling, because as we are creating a digital representation of a cultural object that we study, we are constructing a model. It's a surrogate that is not the object itself. It is a representation of it. And McCarthy says that it's an attempt to capture the dynamic experiential aspects of a phenomenon, which is somewhat unattainable because they're dynamic and experiential, right? So it can only be an attempt. And oftentimes, if we know what we're going to do with that model, it means that we're created for a specific purpose of study. So the same cultural object may be represented as data in very different ways, depending on what your final end goal is. For example, with a literary text, and I'll go through this again, but a piece of literature, we could represent it as just words in order to make it simple for algorithms to count those words and give us important statistics, not important, but interesting statistics about use certain words, etc. But if we want, for example, to build a digital publication for that text, something that is sort of meant to be consumed by humans through hypertext and the web, then we will be modeling that text in very different ways, and we will be potentially adding extra information that is useful for human consumption, etc. So another sort of postulate of this idea is that models conceal when they reveal. This is sort of a consequence of the fact that you are creating a model for one or more purposes, which means that you will inevitably leave something out. And that's important both for sort of understanding why something may be left out and sort of question that from a critical perspective, like why are you modeling something versus another, or leaving certain aspects out, but also maybe revealing in the sense that you may find the model that you've created inadequate, and through that failure you go back heuristically to the modeling process again, which is kind of what the main point of William McCarthy's to explain why it's useful to focus on modeling as an activity in the digital humanities. Okay, so there are a number of types of data in the humanities which can map with types of data that computers understand. And just to name a few, you can have linear data, which is usually represented as sort of a sequence of things, and text is definitely one of those. You have sort of a sequence of characters. Therefore, when you do operations on them, you can rely on the fact that it's organized linearly. You can have structured data, which means that you are imposing specific relationships between objects that you are representing, and one typical one is a relational database, which is made of tables of it that are connected to each other, or also, that the network that Jordan was showing earlier, the network itself is, talking about specific objects and organizes them in a structure that in this case is a graph, right, where you have these nodes connected by edges. And occasionally you may have semi-structured data where there is sort of a less strict codification of the measurable, to quote Flanders again, but it's it's connected with, for example, in linear text, you can still sort of have that linearity to rely on, but you can then use some tags or remarks that the computer will recognize to indicate what certain portions of that linear text is. So a typical example is something like HTML, where you are dealing with sort of a linear textual document, but there is some structure scattered across that allows you to then sort of publish it through the browser. And then you have binary data, which is essentially the kind of direct instructions to the computer. These will be things like images and audio signals and videos and other sort of assets like that, as well as computer code once it gets compiled in a way that the computer can understand it. So this is an oversimplification, but I just want to give you an idea of what it means to manipulating data that is, organized in those different types of things. Usually that is done through code, which is a set of instructions that are given to a computer in order to process the data. So typically there will be some sort of input, it goes through a transformation of some sort, and then you get some output that you can pass on to more code, or maybe that's the end product, etc. It's sort of circular. So this code is typically written by people, and it can get structured into specific resources. So I may be talking in the next for the next few slides about code libraries, for example. So that's essentially a tool made of code that allows you to do certain operations, and you can rely on to use it to manipulate data in certain ways. And typically, these code libraries will use a programming interface or API, which allows you to functions that the libraries define. And you can do that either by writing more code, so you can use these APIs programmatically, or perhaps there is a graphical user interface that is built on top of that API that allows you to interact with the data and run operations on it by clicking on buttons and using forms and things like that. But once you are done clicking on that button, some code gets executed in order to manipulate the data and give you back a result, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell, very briefly, how how we work with data in the humanities. But in fact, just in general with computers, it's a simplification. But I've sort of tried to highlight typical types of data and operations that can be done with humanities within the humanities. And now I'm going to focus on sort of looking at different types of methods. And I want to point out this blog post, and there's also a very interesting video by Miriam Posner called "How Did They Make That?" that sort of takes exactly this approach of looking at existing projects and sort of reverse engineering them to some extent and figure out what data they were using, what kind of code they were using in order to obtain their research goal. And I also wanted to emphasize what Jordan already mentioned, that is kind of that we can meaning that as I consider that there is certainly a lot that you can learn on your own, and there's a lot that you can achieve on your own through self-study and figuring out some of these tools work, etc. In order to create something that it's a more fully fledged research project, it is very likely that that will have to be some sort of collaborative effort. So keep that in mind as we go through apologies, so that you don't think that you need to know all of this stuff through digital humanities. One thing is certain, though, it's very good to know to try and understand, so that when you're collaborating with others, you know what they're talking about, how we should proceed, even though you may not be the person who ends up writing code. And I also wanted to point out this project by Daria, which is a digital humanities European association called Open Methods, where these a website where you can explore the European project, but it's another place where you can get a sense of what kind of operations you can do with humanities. And I will be going this way. Okay, so I wanted to start by talking about and collections. So this is, especially for sort of entry digital force and archival work, you're digitizing some documents, you are essentially, creating. One of the things that you could do is organize this collection and actually publish it online as a companion to your more analog study, for example. And that is a way to generate more access as well. It may not have found its way into your your article or sort of your conclusions. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable, right? But it may not be as visible. So this is, web publication in particular is one of the ways of making some of our research be more visible and accessible, like Jordan was saying. So the work is back and you can use this to create a collection of sources, for example, facsimile of primary sources or catalogs where you are sort of talking about specific objects that exist in the real world and you're adding more information about them. And it's typically then published on the web with features that make it possible to search through this collection, to browse it, and it will typically have, a taxonomy or tags, other sort of finding aids to go through the collection and how you have organized it. In order to create something like this, typically, especially if you're creating a collection of primary sources, you will have to digitize them somehow. Maybe documents, you may be scanning them. If it's objects and you're able to photograph them, you can do that. Or maybe someone else has done it already, but you are working with those digitizations that others have created, right? You need to have something to collect, essentially. And then you will be adding extra metadata, which is information about the objects in the collection. And then you can rely on certain tools to publish this data. And one tool that is used often in digital humanities is called Omeka, which allows you to enter all this information via forms, for example. And here, this is a screenshot, or not a screenshot, but rather a schema, diagram, a representation of the database of Omeka. And so each one of these is tables, and you can see that there is a table of items that have certain properties, such as an ID, whether they belong in a collection, is it public. Then there's a list of item types, and there is a table of collections. And then all of these are coordinated so that one item has an item type and a collection, this kind of stuff, that then allows the computer to build the kind of presentational offer to our users, as well as information that you want to capture. So Omeka is one of these tools that allows you to do this work through a graphical user interface. You essentially fill out forms, but you can also build your own software, for example, Postgres SQL. And SQL is sort of the language that allows you to manipulate, or one of the main languages that allows you to tabular data. So a little bit more about Omeka. But specifically thinking about how to build a website on top of that representation. Omeka is popular because it comes with existing user interface concepts and themes, so it's easy to build a site. But if you want to build your own, then that requires you to write code to retrieve the data from the database and create web pages. And one popular application for doing so, for example, among many, many others, is Django, which comes with great database management built in and an accessible API that allows you to code a website fairly quickly. And it's popular, so there are a lot of teaching resources for learning how to build a project in Django. Omeka is more entry-level because it comes with all that support to help you build things. But once you want to start creating something that is more unique and better tailored to your needs, then that's when you have to start writing code or working with someone who can. So I wanted to show you what Omeka looks like. And it's a free tool, but you will have to host it yourself. Costs money. They offer a plan, which also costs money. But you can try it out for free. So I just want to show you what it looks like by creating a collection for my month. So here is omeka.net, and I have, a site that I've created through their free trial. If I go and manage the site, here you can see that, and a full installation of Omeka will give you even more options than this. But essentially, what we want to work with is the three main tables of the database. You can have items, you can have collections, and item types. So let's start with a collection. I've already created. No, okay, I'll create a collection. And we'll, I'm operating on the database right now, but I'm essentially doing it through forms. So I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to call it my mugs. And you can write a lot more information: topic, description, creator, etc. And Omeka is relying on something called the Dublin core, which is a very simple set of metadata elements that can be understood by other applications as well. So they're trying to be reusable, right? So I'm going to add this public collection. And now that I've made it public, the code here already knows how to also visualize the collection. So this is not a part of the site that will be visible to my users. This is essentially a tool that Omeka provides to build and populate the database. Then I'm going to add an item. I've already added one. So I'm going to add another. I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to call it the Guggenheim. I'm going to say that, so see how item type here lets me select from a list is because there is a table of item types. It comes already pre-populated with a lot of interesting things, including the fact that I'm talking about, say, a physical object, but you can add your own concept. So it can be quite flexible. And I'm going to add an image of it. And then I'm going to add it to a collection. Again, there's a drop-down menu here because I'm connecting it to a different table in the database. Add item. It's uploading the image, so let me take a second. But next, I'm going to go back to the collection and just switch over to the public part of the site. Users will be able to look at the collection and explore it and see the information that I've added about these different items. Since that's taking a while, I'm going to go back to collections. You can see them both here. I forget how to go to the public part of the site. I think I just click on it. View public page. Okay. Right, so it comes with a very basic site, but you can change this, and it comes with a lot of themes that you can get. You can really sort of make it your own. And here I'm just seeing basic information about my collection, which I haven't really populated, but then eventually also lists the items in it. I forgot to attach the other one, but anyway, then you can access more information about each item, and so this becomes a way for your users to explore your collection. And it comes with its own, search facility, etc. So if you have a large corpus and you have the patience to put it together, you are essentially building a resource that can be used for further research or to support research that you have published elsewhere, such as in an article. Okay, moving on. The other type of methodology that I want to talk about is digital scholarly editions. This is one of the fields I spent most time in, and essentially it focuses on textual data, which often comes from physical objects, which could be things like manuscripts or printed documents. Sort of scholarly editions traditionally are created for print, and it's done by sort of focusing on a specific work or collection of works and looking at their history. Look at the manuscript when they were first drafted, then at their sort of first print and how they got disseminated and new editions came out, etc. And as a scholar, you do sort of a work of understanding this history and potentially identifying differences that exist among all the different sources that are extant for this work. And then you create a new book that publishes the text according to how you view it based on your historical research, as well as a bunch of extra information about what you found out when you went digging into the archive. Once you target the digital medium as a way of publishing all that information, you have greater possibilities than the ones provided by a regular book to show your users the work that you've done and sort of teach them more about the history of the specific text that you've been working with. And the typical technology for doing this kind of work is a form of semi-structured data, in particular, descriptive markup. So if you've ever seen an HTML document, which is what makes web pages essentially, you might have seen this kind of coding with angle brackets. Oftentimes people will associate like this kind of image with the idea of coding itself. But essentially what is happening here is that we're telling the computer how to deal with specific portions of text. And HTML and even things like Microsoft Word will rely on things like this to say, show this in italics or organize this in a paragraph. With descriptive markup, you're essentially doing the same thing, but you're telling the computer what a portion of text is. So you're taking a much more semantic approach to that kind of representation, which allows you to then do further operations on it, both analytical, but primarily in the case of digital scholarly editions, related to publication and scholarly communication. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by looking at the Shelley Governor Archive, which Jordan mentioned before. So one of the first things that we did was to digitize facsimile images of the Frankenstein manuscript written by Mary Shelley, of course, and provide a transcription. And we provided this transcription in a way that actually captures what's called the mise en page of the text. That is how the text has been laid on a specific page. And we took care of adding through tags information about things like what was added, what was deleted, where was it added, and in particular by whom, because there is clear evidence on the manuscript that Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, intervened on the page. And we use that underlying representation to generate multiple views. One is the one that focuses more on the mise en page, often called also sort of a diplomatic rendition that tries to sort of imitate the page so that it becomes essentially kind of a map that lets you understand and decode the image better. In older times, it even had more of a sort of a preservation component to it, because it will be more difficult than it is now to replicate the digital image. Maybe you were looking at it in black and white because you couldn't make it to the archive. So having this kind of diplomatic transcriptions was even more essential. But what we've also included in the underlying encoding is an indication of who wrote what. So that allows us to create a view like this, for example, where you can choose to only look at text that was written by Percy Shelley, text that was written by Mary Shelley, using a highlight. And this was particularly relevant in this case because in the past, scholars have used the fact that Percy's hand can be identified on the page as an indication of the fact that Percy Shelley is in fact the author of Frankenstein, not Mary Shelley. And we wanted, that has been debunked several times, but we wanted to, contribute even further evidence of this fact by making it crystal clear through a form of visualization, essentially, that the intervention by Percy Shelley's are essentially copy editing. And this is what it looks like. which is sort of the same image that you saw before when I mentioned what descriptive markup is. But essentially what's on this page gets transcribed here like with regular letters, but then we rely on these elements or tags in blue to tell the computer that there is a modification here, mod, made of an addition and a deletion, this kind of stuff. So what does this look like when you actually want to go ahead and do it? So the technology that that we use, these angle brackets, is called XML or wow, I'm forgetting the acronym now. It's markup language. And TEI, or the Text Encoding Initiative, is a specific grammar that is imposed on top of the more typical sort of XML structure that can be anything you want. You can name these tags anything you want, but if you provide a grammar, then you can create a specific flavor of encoding, and that's what text encoding is. It's essentially like a grammar that lets you use XML in a certain way. So in order to do something like this, you will first need to obtain a digitized version of your text. It is not too crazy to transcribe it by hand. Editors do that for the preparation of print editions all the time. But if you're lucky enough to have a source that is legible by a computer, you may rely on what's called optical character recognition to determine automatically what characters are on the page, and then you will have sort of a simple transcription that that you will have to likely correct a little bit. And then starting from that, you start adding markup to model the textual phenomena that are relevant to your editorial idea. And there are a number of tools that can support you doing this. The most commonly used one is the Oxygen XML editor, which is free, but it's fully featured. It has a lot of support for this kind of work. And then an alternative that is great for beginners, is a little bit more minimal, but you can still do a lot with it, is using VS Code, which is just a code editor software that is free and open source, published by Microsoft. And there's an extension probably to connect your file with your XML file with a TI schema, and it will give you suggestions and will validate your file. There's a GIF of it here, but I was going to show you what that looks like, with a live example. So here I have one of the texts from early modern songscapes that Jordan mentioned earlier, where we use TI to encode various versions of songs from this book by I forget who wrote it. Anyway, and so here we're providing a bunch of sort of contextual information about each song and the source where it comes from, and then sort of we provide the text itself. And here we're relying on certain elements to mark up stanzas and verse structure. And then we're also adding some elements here, like this seg, to indicate where variants exist, so that we can connect it with other versions of this text. And just to give you an example, as I'm working with this file, if I start typing an element, it will let me know which other elements are available at this specific location in the file, as indicated by the TEI, and give me like a description of it. And similarly, if I want to add, kind of title these as, I can rely on something called like an attribute to provide further information about a specific tag. This is kind of what it looks like when you're doing this work. But then you have to publish it, right? And publishing it, requires kind of a transformation of your encoded text into a number of possible outputs. You could even just be creating a PDF or an ebook, but most typically you end up creating an interactive website like the Shelley Goblin Archive. You can do this in a number of ways, but two relatively accessible tools are TI Publisher, which is the one pictured here. That sort of comes with a lot of built-in views to display text and create search indexes and connect them with images. The catch is that it requires using Exist, which is an XML database, and just like with Omeka, you have to have a server and a little bit of knowledge on how to set it up in order to publish data. And then another tool, it's called, this is pronounced cetacean, just like the animal that swims in the ocean, or the types of animals that swim in the ocean, cetacean, which is a JavaScript library. I haven't mentioned what JavaScript is so far, but it's essentially code that the browser and more, but particularly the browser can run. And that's, every time that you click a button on a web page, there's some JavaScript code that does something. So Cetacean is a JavaScript library that you can embed into a site with just a few lines of code, and it allows you to then have a display of the TEI. And you can always write your own transformations using, in particular, XML technologies, because they know how to work with this kind of data very well. And one is XSLT, which is a fully fledged programming language for manipulating XML, or XQuery, which is also a programming language, but it's usually paired with an XML database, and it allows you to retrieve information out of a bunch of XML documents effectively. I also want to briefly mention that you can apply the same concepts to musical texts, in particular music scores. And the Music Encoding Initiative format, it is not the most popular format for representing music for computers, but it is the one that utilizes the same kind of concept of descriptive markup that works well for scholarly activities. MEI, or Music Encoding Initiative, can be then rendered using a tool called Verovio, which generates an image that you can manipulate, and it's connected with its underlying representation. So you can do things like, here in this GIF, it's showing different versions of the same document that have been encoded in MEI, and Verovio adds some interactivity to let you look different versions, like an original version on the text versus one that is being regularized by an editor. Okay, moving along. Another important methodology in DH, and one of the oldest one, is so doing some sort of text analysis, also called text mining, or especially in computer science circles, information retrieval, which is essentially the discipline that gave us Google. And it typically relies on working on plain text data, so essentially just strings of characters, and you build algorithms to retrieve and infer information. You guide the algorithm, but you're sort of letting the machine do that work, and perhaps even learn based on information that it has previously modeled, which is sort of, in a nutshell, how machine learning works in a very sort of simplified way. And the size of the corpus that you have really matters in terms of what algorithms can do for inferring information or for giving you relevant data, because it's often based on statistics and sort of counts of probability. So in order to do this kind of work, the kind of data that you need will be some form of digitized content. So if you're interested in a specific type of literature, or I don't know, newspapers, things like that, you will have to have a transcription that is machine readable of this content. So you need to create it somehow. Using optical character recognition is one of the ways of doing that if all that you have is like images. But there is already a lot out there. For example, Project Gutenberg has been around for decades, and they've been collecting very simple representations of books, in particular books that are out of copyright. But you can apply the same technologies and approaches to the entire web, because the web is very text-based. And if you can rely on certain code typically this is called web scraping, to get a lot of information from the web. And perhaps if you're interested in studying social media, for example, social media companies will often provide an API, an application programming interface, to extract data from their databases. And a lot of them will let you do it for free up to a certain extent. And then if you're doing it too much, then obviously they want to monetize it. But Facebook, Twitter, anything that is publicly available through these platforms can usually be mined. And why would you want these kind of operations? So from a humanities perspective, typically these to test theories. So you have a hunch that something in newspapers changing between the 18th and the 19th century, something happened in the way in which certain news were communicated. I'm making something up, and then you happen to have a lot of access to a lot of transcriptions of newspapers from a specific area at that point in time, and then you start looking for what you think might have occurred there, and see if the numbers back you up. It's a typical use of this kind of analysis, which may or may not result in a beautiful publication. Maybe you just want to find the truth, and then you talk about it in your article and when you discuss your methodology. But essentially, it's a matter of relying on these technologies to find patterns, co-occurrences. Maybe use this to even get some indications of stylistic marks, like has this been written by this author or not? And there is an entire branch of study that called stylometry that focuses exclusively on that. Or maybe you want to learn about language use and grammar. You want computers to learn how to infer grammar rules just out of texts. And then eventually you want to present your findings, perhaps with beautiful interactive visualizations. And there are many ways of doing this kind of work. Just to name a few, it is often convenient to rely on what we know about language structures. So you can use something called natural language processing, and Python, which is a programming language, has a number of tools for doing this work. The NLTK library, the Natural Language Toolkit, allows you to very quickly load in some texts and use built-in sort of grammar concepts to try and get the structure of some text, or try to infer named entities. Like, is this a proper noun? Can I consider it to be of a certain kind? It's the first steps into trying to then build more and more complex queries of the text that you're working with. But you can use also a number of just more generic data analysis libraries that can work with more than just text. One that is quite popular with Python is Pandas. And some of these also come with visualization tools. Another approach that has been quite popular is the topic modeling. That is essentially a statistical model for discovering abstract topics that occur in a collection of documents. And it's done by figuring out what kind of words tend to sort of group together, statistically speaking. And one popular tool for doing this work is a Java library called Mallet. And here I have an image by Paper Machines, which is an extension to Zotero, which is a sort of citation managing software where you can add PDFs of your articles, and then this extension will run topic modeling algorithms on it to see which articles talk about the same thing. And you can see that topics are usually presented as a group of related words, like Irish, Ireland, tenant, landlord, owner. And that's where you can start figuring out what these texts are talking about. And here they've been plotted over a timeline to sort of notice a shift in topics. So what does it look like? It mostly looks like code. Most of the times, if you want to do this work at a level that really gives you good results, you will have to start coding. And I'm not an expert in this, so that's all I can say, really. The other thing I'm going to show, though, is the fact that these libraries, especially the ones that you can kind of use out of the box, they come with an API that allows you to build graphical interfaces that will be able to work with that API. And this is essentially what these Voyant tools website does. So you can give it a text, or even a fairly large quantity of text, and it will just run all of these algorithms for you and show you the results. So it's kind of fun to play around with, especially if you don't really want to get into coding, you just want to try and play around with the text that you have. So with some of my students, we're working now on a travel journal from the 17th century, written by a French essentially a spy more than an explorer, that went to Buenos Aires and then sort of followed the river up to Potosi, where the Spanish were mining a lot of silver. And let's see, hopefully I have it open. I forgot to open it. Let's see if I just get it from here. So I think this link that I'm following, if my computer doesn't get too slow, automatically loads this text, which is book sized, so it's not particularly big, but it's large enough to already give us some interesting insights. When I'm using Zoom, things just get too slow, so I might just show you the screenshot here in the interest of time. But essentially, we'll build something like a word cloud, which Jordan showed in one of his slides. And based on frequency, they will be larger. And you can tell that these tools, at least out of the box, do not understand Spanish very well, because typically grammatical words tend to be removed because they're used a lot, and a means at or towards. So that sort of skews the results. Right? It's one of those words you want to remove so that you get to the meat a little bit faster. And then here you get graphs based on sort of frequency of words and where they occur in document segments. So it sort of breaks down the document so that you can see it in a sequence a little bit more. You can probably set some parameters to control how that works. And if I were able to click on a single word here, this would change to show me information specific to that word. And here on the bottom right, you can see what's called a co-occurrence. So you look at a word and it shows you what frequently comes like before and after it, which can give you some insights. Specifically, I don't know if it's the name of someone, you can maybe get a sense of how they're talked about. A bit of an insight into your text. And this is just the surface. If you then start using these tools programmatically, there's a lot more that you can infer. And if you then want to build a visualization out of it, I already mentioned that many text analysis code libraries will already come with their own visualization functions. One programming language that is used a lot for this work, it's called R, like the letter R. Which also has powerful visualization libraries, or you can make your own. And one of my sort of favorite tools is called D3, which is a JavaScript library. So it targets, for the most part, the web and the browser. It's very versatile and is widely adopted for digital journalism. So if you looked at all those election updates obsessively the past week, a lot of them were built using this technology. Okay, we only have 10 minutes left, more or less, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Another thing that is essential to work with in digital humanities is geography and sort of space and place. Whether we are working with historical material or present one, it tends to be situated somewhere. And there's a lot that we can say about the world and how it's connected to the cultural objects that we study. A typical way of doing this in the digital humanities is to, plot things on maps, and often in an interactive way, so that you can use maps as a way of showing your scholarship, as a way of storytelling, as a way of teaching your findings to others. And this is done relying on geographical coordinates. to attach information to a specific place. This is not a technology that is being developed by the digital humanities. This very much comes from the sciences. It's called geographical information systems, and it's widely used across disciplines, really, social sciences, meteorology, but also the humanities. And typically, this information will be stored as structured, or even more often as semi-structured data, like in XML formats or JSON formats. That is sort of a similar idea to XML. And then it gets processed via code or with GIS tools so that you can create visualizations, such as this one here. This is a project called Torn Apart, or Separados, which maps ice facilities in the US and provides a lot of context and extra information. It's really fun to explore, actually, because it really, it's been around for a few years now, and really sort of calls out, people. As you click on this, you will see like which politician funded it and all of that. It's a way of doing really sort of activist humanities research here. But very popular use is to work with historical data and plot it. So here, for example, in Digital Harlem, this is relying on a Google Maps application, which allows you to program it to add extra layer of information on top of it. So they actually took old maps from 1920, 1925, 1930, so that you can get a sense of how the space has changed and who was there. So there's a very rich amount of information here that tells the story of a specific place in the world. Google Maps is not the only one that allows you to do this. You can do it with like Bing Maps and other ones. But if you really want to build your own with maximum flexibility, then Leaflet is one JavaScript library that allows you that level of flexibility. And it's actually not all that hard to use. Another way of telling stories through geographical data is using what's called a story map. This is actually a product of ArcGIS, which is an expensive professional software for doing, usually like sort of urban studies work and urban planning even. But again, you can layer, but by layering more information on it, there's a lot that you can show what happened in the past. So you can, annotate the world that you see now. And with their story maps, you can actually build like a narrative through it, and it gets presented as a web page. And as you scroll through, it will like move the map in different places, so that you can, show some information that describes what you're seeing. Right, it kind of becomes like a little documentary that you go through by scrolling with your mouse. Right, I wanted to quickly show what it looks like to create something like this using Google. If you have Google Drive as a person at UMD, you will be able to do this. You can create your own map, and you can add different kinds of things on the map, often just places or lines or areas with some basic information attached to it. And you can always export it using this KML format, which then will allow you to import it into more professional software, or build another map with Leaflet. You can get that data out. It's just that the Google Maps doesn't really allow you to add a lot of information to it. And very briefly, I was gonna sort of piggyback on the work that one of my students did last year, Brittany Drake. For a final project, she collected information about Google venues around DC, and she created a map with it. And you can see it. It's linked here once you get the slides. There's a lot more information, but like some of these locations are here. Like one is in 7416 Baltimore Avenue. So if I, working with my map, I can say 7416 Baltimore Avenue in College Park. It comes up, I don't think it's a place that is open anymore, but I can then add it to my map, right? And you can see how it gets like structured in a layer, and you can add multiple layers, which allows you to sort of build different types of data that you want to put on a map, for example, and you can add some information about it. Mostly it's just a free text, so you can't really structure it, but well, you say it was called Paragon, so I don't know, I'm just going to say like Paragon. And now I've added it to my map. And if I keep on going, I can structure this information here, and it is somewhat trivial to then like embed it in a website where I may be providing further context about this research that I did, and this just becomes an instrument to present it. Okay, another type of work that can be done that is worth talking about is linked open data. So we've seen what graph data looks like, but you can go beyond sort of network visualization and analysis, because graphs are massively addressable. You can keep on adding things as long as there is like a URL for each of these nodes. You can then target the URL and say something more about it. The web itself is a graph because we can link all these different pages, and the pages are the nodes, right? This is based on this idea of a semantic triple, where you have a subject, a predicate, and an object. For example, I can say College Park, which is the node, is located in Maryland. And then I can say more specifically about Maryland, more about College Park. But this triple is giving me the piece of information of College Park's location. And here, it's not as explicit, but essentially what these arcs mean is connected to, right? And then we are relying on thickness to express another semantic triple that is like by this factor, right? And that's the thickness essentially. But so if you start providing interesting predicates and put them on the web, you start building what's called the semantic web. And there are sets of ontologies that suggest what kind of properties and what kind of arcs you may want to build. And then you can start relying on interesting aspects of the web to enrich your publication and your collection of data. So one useful thing in this world is gazetteers, which allow you to find reliable pointers to known things. So VIAF is the virtual international authority file, which contains a lot of information in multiple languages about people and places, in particular people. So this is the page for Frederick Douglass, and it comes with all sorts of variants that have been inferred from exploring the web, and so it gets collected here. So if you encounter any of these strings, you can go here and figure out which Frederick Douglass are we talking about, and that comes with a permalink, or sort of a URL, or that allows you to then link to this specific object. And you can also download all this information as a graph with all the language information and all of that, but you can just treat this as a node as you're building your own collection, for example. And I don't have time to show you what that looks like. I'm just going to point to Recogito, which is a award-winning tool that allows you to work with texts and like connect different parts of the text with existing ontologies and sort of authority files that exist on the web. So you can highlight something and connect it with repositories so that you know exactly what Buenos Aires means here. There is a Buenos Aires in Mexico, for example, right? So by relying on something like VIAF, in this case, we're using geonames, you can indicate exactly which Buenos Aires are you talking about. I'm going to skip, just 1 minute on minimal computing. So everything that we've seen so far is complex and requires infrastructure, etc. And we also talked about how digital humanities projects require a lot of funding, etc., which makes access to this kind of work a privilege. And what if we start looking at doing digital humanities under constraints instead? What does it look like to do digital humanities where you do not have access to powerful hardware, to powerful software, to network capacity, or even a voice? And so this group from the Global Outlook DH has been coming up with, let's say, essentially a philosophy on how to, bring these kind of questions to the fore, as well as a number of potential solutions, including, creating alternatives to something like Omeka, that instead of having to rely on a large database and having to be hosted and maintained on expensive servers, something that you can more easily bring up, and maybe it's not as fully featured, but will still allow you to build a collection of items that then you can put even on a pen drive and be able to give it to someone, or on the web, but through like free hosting services, for example. So rethinking the age from that perspective. There is a lot more that you can learn, and this was a very partial view, and there are a number of DH courses on campus. I encourage you to have a look as a humanist what's in your college, because there are a few that I may not even know about. But what I know about is what we offer at MITH, the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities. I'm now teaching MITH 301, which focuses on digital publishing and scholarly editions, but using minimal computing. And this is a global classroom, so it's done in collaboration with students from Argentina. We also offer an independent research study, MITH 388. You can take it as 1, 2, or 3 credit course, and we help you design your own DH project, and we work with you to bring it, to complete it. And MITH 735 is a graduate course called Anatomy of DH Research, where we go through the kind of methodologies just similar to what I've done here, but over an entire course. I used to teach this with a colleague, but now I'm too busy with MITH 301, so I'm not teaching it right now, but others are. And there's also a graduate certificate, the Digital Studies in Arts and Humanities. But there's also a lot that you can learn on your own. Programming Historian is a great resource with entry-level tutorials for all of these kind of methodologies. But also have a look at the offering from UMD on LinkedIn courses, where you can find LinkedIn Learning, where you can find courses on Python, R, website building, data analysis. Now that you know which methodologies are useful, you don't have to necessarily start from digital humanities. You can start from the methodology, right? Learn it, and then you can bring it to your own work. And we're over time, so I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening.
Okay, great. Lindsay, you wanna? Yeah.
Yeah, that was great, and I know that there is so much more to learn, but that was also very comprehensive, especially for somebody like me who is a beginner in this area. I had a quick question. You mentioned at one point about how some of the text analysis tools aren't well suited to, in that example, Spanish wasn't able to pick up on the use of as like an article. And so I wondered if that's something common that you see across some of these tools, that they are primarily set up for English, and if there are languages that we're on adapting tools to be more responsive to them.
Well, that sort of definitely used to be the case. That is changing. The easiest language is to find support for it and to be English and German, and French to some extent. But in a way, like Google itself really sort of brought forth a lot of innovation around sort of language support, and you can now work with most languages. That work is never done, but at this point, it's a lot easier. So let me quickly with Recogito. So here, for example, I have that text from the explorer, the 17th century explorer, in English and in Spanish. The date is later because of I'm using a later edition. But so if I look at the Spanish text, sorry, actually both in Spanish, but I can say, so Recogito comes with a name entity recognition system, which uses natural language processing to try and determine what words are proper nouns and whether they are places or people. So when you do this, you can use a number of open source recognition engines. And the people who created Recogito work with Greek and Latin a lot. So the default one is Greek, for example. But the Stanford Core and NLP comes with at least 4 languages. So because this stack specifically is in Spanish, I can tell it to use that engine, and it will then run the algorithms behind the scenes and attempt to identify places and people at the very least. If that's taking too long, I can open one that I already.
And while that's opening, I'll just say, Peter.
But you get the
idea. Peter, no worries about not having a camera or mic. It's hard. Did you have any questions, Peter, that you wanted to put in the chat for me today? Oh, okay, I see.
He makes a note about how it can be difficult to talk into the void. I agree.
Yeah.
But thank you for coming, Peter.
So,
yeah, thank you.
Primarily for languages that use the Latin alphabet, or are there ways to do it for like Cyrillic or Kanji or anything?
Yeah, there are definitely tools for that as well. Yes, you just need to know where to find them. I don't know enough about text analysis to answer that with confidence. But for example, I know that for optical character recognition, OCR, there are now a number of which relies a lot more on machine learning to really function at high level. There are models for languages there's a big project working on Arabic right now, Arabic script, which has different languages, including Farsi and classic Arabic, etc. But yeah, I think where big issues are really is with languages that are not necessarily written left to right or even right to left. So it's when we start getting into languages that already have very little representation that things get more complicated.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Sorry, that speaks a little bit to some of the crowdsourcing issues too. There was a talk at Myth last year. The researcher I'm forgetting now, but he was he was doing some transcription of Hebrew manuscripts. And that was one of the issues that they had, was that there wasn't a reliable dictionary, and there wasn't for multiple reasons, because in manuscripts there's a lot of abbreviations and things like this. So coming up with a reliable set, and Cyrillic was one of the characters that he was talking about too, that like with Cyrillic, Hebrew has a lot of issues with a digital format, especially when we're working across centuries.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as you add a sort of temporary dimension, then things get more complicated for sure.
Well, thank you both so much. That was great.